And now, please give a warm welcome to the host of Broadway Buzz, Mr. Joe Gary.
Welcome to Broadway Buzz. Happy New Year, health and happiness in 2026. I'm delighted to be talking about Stereophonic. It's an extraordinary work. It played on Broadway in 2024. It was nominated for 13 Tony Awards. It's the most honored play in the history of the awards. It would win 5 of the big awards, including Best Play of the Year. It's an extraordinary work. It is about an unnamed rock group in 1976 doing their second album. The setting is a unique setting for the theater. It takes place in a recording studio, and we watch over a year's period as this group struggles to create a major work of art. The background story is this unnamed group had a first record that was an enormous hit. It sort of disappeared, but while they're there recording, it comes back and it moves very high on the charts. And so suddenly the recording company says, no, you're not going to have 2 months to do this recording. We're going to give you as much time as you need to create your second album. They're on the cusp of superstardom, and we're watching this group struggle with the pain, the agony, the anxiety, the insecurities of moving in this way in an extraordinary and very competitive art form. I do want to remind you about this show. This show was so brilliantly received in New York. When it moved to Broadway, they announced it would have a very limited 15-week run. They renewed that many times. It played over 300 performances on Broadway. In New York, it was 3 hours and 20 minutes long. They've cut it down for the road, and they've streamlined it in an extraordinary way. Act 1 is an hour and a half, be aware. Act 2 is about an hour and 10 minutes. But it's a work so filled with insight, so filled with character development, so filled with the anxiety of trying to be in competition literally with themselves, that it becomes an extraordinary work of art. Do remember, all of us, every one of us somewhere has a secret album tucked away in our lives that becomes the sort of record of our life. And so all of us have connections to recordings. And so whether it's Perry Como or whether it's the Beatles, music has played a very important part in all of our lives. And what's so brilliant about this script is it shows us what it takes to literally be in competition with yourself and to achieve greatness in a recording. We've all seen struggles of the great writer, the great painter, the great composer, but now we have this opportunity of seeing a rock group coming to terms with themselves. You've seen so many shows. I mean, we think of the Tina Turner show, or we think of the Donna Summers show, or we think of the Cher show, where each of those artists, when they would go back into a studio, would literally be in competition with themselves. I mean, remember the struggle that Michael Jackson went through. We saw that brilliant piece about Michael Jackson, where again, we're seeing the struggle of doing it. But here we have this extraordinary opportunity of being a fly on the wall, of being in that recording studio. And over that year's period, we see them create a great work of art. Great art is not always only about us. Great art is about everyone. And this is a work of art that I would call, it has a very insightful slice of life. When we watch that year, it goes from June 1976 to June 1977, and we watch that year, and we see what happens to those people, to each one of them, and we become very involved with each of the band members, and we become deeply involved with the two engineers who are, putting the work together. It's a very informative work in that it gives us tremendous insight into how a recording is made. Let me just pause and remind you, in this same period of time, in the 1970s, I was lucky enough to do a production of Jacques Brel is Alive and Well and Living in Paris, and we got the rights to do a recording of the show. So we literally went into the studio using exactly the same kind of equipment you're going to see on stage, the 8-track tape, and we recorded Jacques Brel. And I have to tell you, there is something overwhelming about being in a studio doing this. In the theater, it's a very ephemeral experience. If it isn't perfect one night, we can fix it the next night. But once you're there in a recording studio, this is the definitive take on the work. And so there was an enormous amount of pressure. I can tell you there were no sex, drugs, or rock and roll in the Brel experience, but in any case, there is that same kind of pressure to be in competition with yourself to leave a record that is the best record of the work. Okay, so let us start then by looking at the show had this tremendous success. It played over 305 performances in New York. It swept the awards, as I told you. It's recently opened in London to great success. The Brits love the show, and it plays to capacity every night. And on the road, every night they have standing ovations, but the sadness is there is that small segment of the audience that hasn't been instructed that, one, it isn't a musical, no, it's not The Sound of Music, three, it does deal with difficult themes, but then so does life. And it does so in a very insightful way. So let's begin then by talking about the great playwright David Adjmi. He would win the Tony Award for Best Play, and he certainly deserved this. He has a very distinguished pedigree. He was educated at Sarah Lawrence College, where he has an undergraduate degree. He was accepted in the very, very prestigious program in Iowa, the Writers Program, where he did an MFA in playwriting. Iowa was one of the first great universities to focus on not only playwriting, but novel writing, journalistic writing, poetry, and they've trained large numbers of major writers at this phenomenal graduate program they have. So David graduated from there. He would do an internship in London at the Royal Court Theatre, and he would have one of his plays presented at the Royal Shakespeare Company. So this is as distinguished as it gets. When he came back to New York, he still wanted to do as much academic preparation as possible, and he was accepted into probably the most exclusive program for playwrights, and it's a 2-year program that's presented by Juilliard, and it isn't a degree program, it's a certificate program, and at the end of the first year, you're evaluated and reevaluated, and it's decided whether or not you're going to be accepted back for the second year. Tragically, David Adjmi was not accepted back for the second year. You can imagine how embarrassed Juilliard is now after he is the most celebrated playwright in the world in that he has had more nominations for Tony Awards than anyone else. He swept all of the national awards in New York when his show played on Broadway, and he's an extraordinary artist. So there's a lot of red faces at Juilliard saying, "Whoops, we made a little bit of a mistake." In any case, a little bit more about David Adjmi. He's not an artist that you know. I mean, remember in the old days, in the 1940s, 1950s, Broadway was the determinator for the theater. So, if you had a success on Broadway, like Tennessee Williams, like Arthur Miller, you would become a household name, and every magazine would write about you, etc., and every regional theater would do your work. In the case of New York now, Broadway does not focus on theater in the same way that they focus on musicals. So the end result is that these great writers are not getting the exposure they really should have. If you're a New Yorker and you love the theater and you have subscriptions to all of the off-Broadway theaters, then you're very in the know about this. But tragically, Middle America, the rest of America, doesn't have this opportunity. It's always been my dream that writers, playwrights, should also have a forum where their work can go on tour in the same way Broadway shows do. So in any case, David Adjmi really made a name for himself. He worked in all of the great off-Broadway theaters. He worked at some of the great regional theaters. He worked at Yale. He's worked several times in England, so he has impeccable credentials. He wrote a stunning autobiography that was called Lot 6. And if you're interested in the theater and if you're interested in David Adjmi, it's a work I really recommend that you read. I found it absolutely riveting. I mean, many of you remember reading Moss Hart when he wrote Act 4, and many critics said this is the great insight into who a writer is in the theater in that period, in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. But it's really worth looking at David Adjmi's work called Lot, L-O-T, 6, S-I-X. You can find it in the program under his biography. And in any case, it reveals his life in such an extraordinary way. He's a brilliant writer, and substantially, he is Syrian, and his family was Orthodox Jewish. Now, he is a very liberated, very 21st century man, and this doesn't fit with the rigid religious background he had and the religious family background that he had. And so the book is a wonderful exploration of not only finding a way of becoming a writer, and that's done wonderfully. And he talks about his days at Sarah Lawrence and his days at Juilliard. So you really get insight into the mind of a young writer who wants to have a career in the theater. But also, he talks about not only is he trying to find a way of defining his art, but he's trying to find a way of defining himself. And we all go through these struggles. We all go through this anxiety of who am I? How much of the family am I a part of? Who am I individually? All these questions that we ask ourselves, especially as young people, he defines in such a powerful way. So if you love the theater, if you love the idea of understanding more about a playwright, I really recommend that you look at Lot 6. Okay, so now we're ready to talk about David creating Stereophonic. In 2014, he was on an airplane, and he was listening to his headset, and he was listening to one of his favorite recordings. And suddenly it just sort of dawned on him, and he said, I wonder what it would be like to write a play that all took place in a recording studio. Now, writers always deal with time and place and situation. So very quickly, it came to him that he really would like to write a piece that took place about a rock group creating an album. He sets the time, 1976 to 1977. The place, the location, is the recording studio. And this is a very isolated world. And as you will see in the storyline, the cast is there for 20 hours working on a show. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. They're ready to leave, and suddenly someone has an inspiration, so they stay all night. So it becomes an extraordinary idea, and it's a wonderful microcosm. Remember, theater is always about the world that's picked for the story, the location, but then you're always concerned about the outside world and how the outside world impacts it. In the story we're going to see, they're locked away in this studio, literally for a year with one another. And on the outside world, their first album is becoming very successful, and they're really becoming superstars while they're locked away in this microcosm. So it becomes a wonderful idea. Let me just pause and share with you, when you go to the theater now and you see that extraordinary set, I want to remind you, everything on the set works. All of the recording devices work. So what you see downstage, the area closest to you, is you see the control room. And basically you see the two engineers who spend most of their time with their backs to the audience working on their control board. And behind them, and elevated, you will see the recording studio. And the recording studio is enclosed in glass because it has to be a soundproof space. We have access to that sound because the people at the control room can turn on the sound in the recording space. So you can either just have scenes happening in the control room or in the recording studio, or a combination of both. So this makes the space so exciting and so electric. I mean, the title, Stereophonic, meaning that we hear things from multiple locations. The same thing happens in this story. You hear the control people talking, the engineers talking, and then you hear the artist talking. And so we have this, flow of sound coming from two different locations. It's a very dynamic idea. So David Adjmi had a great flight because he came up with a great idea. He would spend the next 10 years realizing that idea. One of the first things he did was to contact a wonderful composer named Will Butler. Will Butler had a famous indies rock group called Arcade Fire, and they recorded 5 or 6 major albums. Will Butler is a very articulate young man, had a very interesting education outside of music, and so he's exceedingly articulate. So the two men had never met, but David wrote to him blindly saying, "We share a mutual friend, and I know you know a lot about music, and I know you've been in a recording studio a great deal. I want to write a play that takes place in the 1970s in a recording studio, and I've never been in a recording studio, so I'm going to do a lot of research, of course, but I could use your help. Are you interested in working with me on this project?" So the two men literally, for 4 years, Will literally taught him about what it takes to work in a studio, what the anxiety is, what the frustration is, the joy, the terror, the insecurity, all of the things that happen. And so they worked in great detail. I told you at the very beginning, critics have written about the idea that this show is hyper-realistic. I like to say that it's really naturalistic. Let me just pause for a moment and remind you about those words. As we moved into the early 20th century, all of our plays were romantic. We would go to the theater to see life as it ought to be, a sort of fairy tale view of life, a melodramatic view of life. But then the great realists came along, like Ibsen, like Strindberg, like Chekhov, and we started seeing life as it is. So realism would become very important. But at the same time in Russia, we had a great writer named Gorky who decided that he wanted to write about life in a very naturalistic way, where he literally, the phrase was, he wanted to lift a slice of life out of life and put it on the stage. So Gorky would write a play called The Lower Depths. which was a play about life at the bottom in Russia, where people are literally starving to death, where they take the food out of the mouth of a dying person so that they can stay alive. I mean, it is life at the bottom. And it was a very shocking production that was done by the Moscow Art Theater. But it established this idea of showing us this very detailed slice of life. And that is the mindset that David Adjmi has when he writes this show. At the beginning of the show, you have to lean in as the audience. You have to make a commitment to want to listen to. I mean, we don't want you judging the people. We don't want you saying, oh, they're taking coke. Oh, they're saying foul things. Oh, they're living with one another. No. We don't want to enter into any of that. We want to enter into the world. And, you know, what the audience does in the theater is we make the agreement to, I'll enter into this, I'll go along with this story. I don't have to agree with it, I don't have to approve of it, but I have to enter into it to experience it. And the reward is extraordinary when you do this. So David is very clever. And so for these 4 years, he works with Will Butler. He creates these fabulous characters. They're very similar, actually. You remember a rock group in the 70s called Fleetwood Mac. They have, sold 120 million records. It was a rock group that had both British performers and American performers in the same way. In the show you will see 3 Brits as musicians and 2 Americans. The same composition happened at Fleetwood Mac in that period. And there is another parallel to Fleetwood Mac. In that same period, they would do a major recording called Rumors in 1977 that would literally establish them as international superstars. So that's the kind of formula that's being used. But David Adjmi is not really plagiarizing their life. He's just using that as a reference point. And the music that ultimately Will Butler will create for this show is extraordinarily powerful and really creates the sound of music in the 1970s. I think it is a really brilliant score. And, I played that album almost every day. And the thing that's so exciting about the show when you see it is as they always knew they were not creating a musical. They always knew they were creating a play with music. So very often in the show, you will only hear fragments of music. You will hear a few measures from a song. There are only 2 songs that are played through. And you keep learning so much as you're watching this to see how the simple changing of a rhythmic beat or the simple changing of a harmony will transform the story. So this work plays itself out on so many ways. It's a wonderful piece of theater. It's a tremendous exercise in learning about the power of art and the pain of making art. And it's tremendous insight into the record business and into the world of rock and roll and into the pain and anxiety that exists there. So in any case, by 2018, they had a pretty strong sense of script. They had a pretty strong sense of space and time. And at this point, they would then add a brilliant director, a magnificent choice. His name is Daniel Aukin. His father, incidentally, was a very famous British director and worked for the National Theatre for many years. I saw all of his work in that period in the 70s and 80s. And David's mother, an American, was also a very distinguished theater director, and she worked in regional theaters doing very experimental theater for its time. At that time, I was working on a book on the British regional theater, which incidentally I never got to publish. I was too busy directing. I never got to finally write it. But in any case, it was a wonderful experience. And in that period, I did go to all the regional theaters, and I met his mother many times and interviewed her many times as she was doing all of this sort of groundbreaking work. So Daniel came from this very distinguished family. And he came to America and he studied at the University of Chicago and he studied comparative religions. But while he was there, I mean, Chicago is a great theater town, and the campus at the University of Chicago is a hotbed for the development of young theater artists. And so he got very involved in that world. And happily, he became a major director, and he's had a very distinguished career in America. He's created a theater off Broadway that I'd really like you to look at sometime. It's called Soho Rep. And of all of the theaters in New York, it is the one that has the youngest audience. And so, all of us, from Great Lakes Shakespeare Festival to the Cleveland Playhouse, can learn from Soho Rep to see how they draw so many young members to be a part of their audience community. Anyway, Daniel Aukin makes a very big name for himself off-Broadway, working at all the great off-Broadway theaters, and he's hired to be the director of this show. He is what we call an actor's director. Actors love to work with him because he's so collaborative and there's very little ego, and he works very much on everything is about the character and bringing the character to life, as you will see. So again, I want to remind you, don't keep judging these characters, just experience them. And as we keep peeling away layer after layer after layer, we will find their humanity. We will find their strength, their weakness, their talent, their insecurities, their joys. It's remarkable work, and he does this in an extraordinary way. David Adjmi writes this script. It's a 4-act play. I can't remember when I read the last 4-act play. Plays are 2 acts, 1 act, 3 acts. Shakespeare wrote 5-act plays, as Moliere did, but nobody wrote 4-act plays. So what you will see, part 1, when you go to the theater, the first hour and a half is Act 1 and Act 2. There's a brief pause between Act 1 and Act 2. You will see projections that will say Act 1, Act 2. But the story is written in a series of scenes because it's showing the passage of time. I lament the fact that they don't, when they post the beginning of a scene, that they don't tell you what the passage of time is. You have to look at it in your program before so you can see how months pass. So structurally, it is put together so that it shows us a year in the life of these artists, and we keep moving usually several months at a time. And then it's part 1 is Act 1 and Act 2. Part 2 is Act 3 and Act 4. That is an hour and 10 minutes long. I tell you, the time goes by so quickly. You're so involved in what's happening. Time is not an issue. So in any case, this show goes into starts working with the wonderful director Daniel Aukin, and they present it at the Sundance Institute. It's so successful there that 5 years later, after much more work, it would move to Playwright's Horizon in 2023. Where it opened to rave reviews. It won all the Off-Broadway awards, and then it very quickly was optioned for its Broadway run. One of the things I want you to be aware of is we are watching brilliant actors at the top of their form, but they also have to be singers, and we also have to believe that they're part of a famous rock group. So they have to function as a band. They have to function as musicians. They spent as much time in rehearsal teaching the actors how to play instruments, and they play them with such distinction that you become incredibly involved and you believe that they are about to become great artists. So this is a major work. And it really shows us where the theater can go. The theater is endless. It's only about what you can imagine to happen. And David Adjmi is a genius, and I admire his work tremendously, and I think you're in for a remarkable treat. Please enjoy Stereophonic.